Singularity.
After an interview I published a couple of months ago, a friend and longtime podcast listener, Professor Tim Beeler, wrote to say that the argument made by my guest was valid in classical logic, but there are many other logics where it simply doesn't hold. Now, as someone with an undergraduate degree in philosophy, complete with a course in formal logic, I was vaguely aware of things like Boolean and fuzzy logic. But the idea that there are multiple logics producing fundamentally different kinds of reasoning and conclusions honestly blew my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It made me realize that I've spent my life looking at logic through a straw. So I decided it was time to widen my point of view. My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoyed this podcast, you can show your support by writing a review on iTunes or by becoming a patron via interviewthefuture.com. My guest today is Professor Graham Priest, one of the world's most influential philosophers of logic, best known for arguing that some contradictions are not only unavoidable, but true. He is a distinguished professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center and the author of landmark works such as In Contradiction and Beyond the Limits of Thought. What makes Graham especially compelling is that his philosophy is also lived. Alongside his work in logic, he has long engaged with Buddhist philosophy and trained in karate, earning 3rd dan in Shobukai and 4th dan in Shitoryu, bringing together rigor, paradox, and practice in a way that very few philosophers do. So, welcome to Singularity FM, Graham.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you for having me on your program.
Fantastic. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while because, as you will discover, logic is not one of my strengths, to say the least. But before we get there, let me ask you this. Who is Graham Priest really, beyond the CV and the academic titles?
Gosh, what a question. Look, I'm a very ordinary person. I grew up a working class kid in London. I studied at university. I emigrated to Australia, got married, had a family. Then my kids left home. My marriage broke up. I moved to the US. I'm now remarried. I've always worked as a philosopher, which has been a real plus. I love doing philosophy. For many years, as you said, I trained in Karate Do, and that was a major part of my life. I love music. I often go to the Met in New York City. And I'm just curious about most intellectual things. Is that enough?
Yeah, I tried to summarize it in a single sentence. I would probably say the last thing you said, curious about most things.
Yeah.
That's a good summary. And based on my preliminary research in your background and your academic and other work, I would totally agree with that. And we share that, by the way, just like a little bit of a background in martial arts. There was a time in my life when I used to do Aikido pretty intensely for a Westerner, and I even considered going to Japan and becoming an Uchideshi in Hombu Dojo and all of that. Eventually decided against it, but it used to be a major part of my life for about maybe 5 or 6 years. So, Graham, you grew up a Christian and then became an atheist in Cambridge, but later wrote deeply on Buddhist philosophy, yet without becoming a Buddhist. What changed along your journey and what stayed the same throughout all that time?
Okay, so I grew up as a Christian because my mother was Christian. She sent me to church, and I was quite a devout Christian. And then when I left home and went to university, I started thinking about Christian views. I was studying mathematics, not philosophy, but I've always had, I guess, philosophical implications. And so I started thinking about the views, and they just didn't stack up for me. So I came to the view that there was no good reason to believe many of the Christian philosophical views, such as theism and so on. So I became an atheist, and I still am. I didn't know anything about Buddhism at that time. That came much later in my life when I'd been a practicing philosopher for 25 years, and then I discovered that I knew only about half the world's philosophy. I knew nothing about the Asian traditions, so I set about finding out. And the one I've investigated most is Buddhism. And I'm not a Buddhist, but there are many things in Buddhist philosophy that I think get it right. Their view about the nature of life, the nature of persons, how one should live one's life, those things rang true for me. And, not only that, I think they can be rationally grounded in a way that Christian views cannot. What has remained constant in all that time? I guess the importance of other people for me, because ethics is about how you treat both yourself and other people. And Buddhism is very strong on one's relationship with other people. So is Christianity in many ways. So maybe that's something from Christianity that's stuck. I believe that we have, in an ethical life, we have a deep responsibility for not just ourselves, but other people. And that was something actually that was brought home to me very much in my training in Karate Do. Because, as you know, Karate Do is a training in violence. That's undisputable. But that's just to say that is to really misdescribe it, because it's a Tao. It's a way of life, and so it informs your whole personality. And one thing you learn when you're studying and teaching philosophy is the importance of other people. You learn from people better than you. You teach people who are still progressing in the discipline. You have to show respect. You have to show understanding. You have to relate to people. And that's a skill you take outside the dojo. So you realize how important your relationships with other people are. So I guess that's something that's remained constant for me through most of my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the other translation of Do, not as a way, but as a path, because I feel like philosophy is the same way. You only start on the path, you never actually finish, you never get to a destination, but you have to walk it kind of every day. And some days you'd be more eager to walk on than others. Some days you'll be tired and would be really not feeling up for it, maybe even grunting and complaining, but yet it's a pursuit that's a lifelong pursuit of walking the path. It's a never-ending path, but it's, I think, very rewarding, whether it comes to philosophy, whether it comes to martial arts, whether it comes to Buddhism, and they're all kind of enriching in a different, but also in a shared way.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, sometimes when people ask me a religion, I say semi-facetiously philosophy, because it's one of the major things that informs my life.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan myself. But so let me ask you this, though. One case in your example of a big decision moment for you was when you were offered two academic positions at the same time, one at St. Andrews and one in Melbourne. And I read an interview where you said that logic didn't give you a clear answer and you consequently agonized while trying to make that decision for about a month, I think. So what did that experience teach you about the limits of formal reasoning or logic?
Yes. Okay. Well, it's a very specific part of logic here. It's called decision theory. I mean, some people think of it as logic. Some people think of it as a separate branch of probability theory or even economics. And what decision theory says is that when you make a decision under conditions of uncertainty, let's keep it simple. You write down the pros and cons, you write down the values to you and their probabilities, and then you do essentially a weighted sum of those things, and you choose the option which comes out best. Okay, that's the sort of decision theory 101. And I wasn't sure what to do. I mean, I was attracted by both positions. And in the end, I resorted to decision theory. So I wrote down all the pros and cons, and they were pretty certain. So there wasn't much issue about probability. And then I had to put down the values. And, you have to assume that these come in a linear scale. Well, at least that's the standard procedure. And it was just silly. I couldn't rank these things against each other. I couldn't say, there was no metric saying how much more important that one was than another. It was just crazy. So it didn't help at all. And then I was chatting to a friend about this, and he said, you should make a decision with your heart.
What a revelation.
And he said, if you made the wrong decision, you'll soon know it. And I thought, okay, fine. Well, everything else has failed. So I chose with my heart, so to speak. Obviously that's a metaphor, but what it means is that you just go with your gut emotions, not rationality. Not that these things are as distinct as people make out. That's another story. But I chose with my emotions, and I was happy with the choice I made.
What that does tell us about the limits of logic and or formal theory, or at the very least, decision theory, but maybe even wider and broader to formal reasoning and logic.
Logic, generally speaking, look, the word logic gets used in many ways, and we might want to talk about that in due course.
We will, yes.
But logic is a tool, okay? It has many uses. And when it's an appropriate tool, it works very well. We can talk a bit about what the applications are. But it's a tool in the end. And all tools have their limitations. Lots of tools won't do things for you. If you try and repair your plumbing with, I don't know, let's say a violin bow, you're not going to get very far. So when you have a tool, you've got to understand its appropriate uses if you want to use it advisedly. Mm-hmm. And that's the way I feel about logic.
Mm-hmm. I've had 3 moments in my life, at least, where I've had to make major decisions in my life like that. The first one was when I was considering whether I should leave Bulgaria or not. And come to the United States as a student. The second one was whether I should leave the United States and come to Canada instead. And the third one was whether I should ask to marry my wife, who was at the time my girlfriend, or not. All 3 occasions were illogical decisions in a way. So
illogical or alogical?
Well, illogical, probably, because if you followed logic, I should have stayed in Bulgaria, perhaps. I should have not left the United States and come to Canada, because in Bulgaria, I had a very good job. I had an apartment to live in. My mother died when I was 13 from cancer, and, my dad started drinking, and I basically left home when I was 13 and a half. But due to a fortuitous sort of unfolding of circumstances, after I served my time in the army, I ended up with a great job at the time, working on the reception desk of the first private hotel in my city. So I was making more money than most people I knew around me. I had a great place to live. I had a beautiful girlfriend, and people would tell me, you're crazy. You're going to abandon all of this. You're going to sell your apartment. You're going to quit your job. You're going to break up with your beautiful girlfriend. why? To go somewhere and start from nothing, right? And you don't even know what's going to happen after, right? So it was illogical for many people around me to make the decision I made. Then in the United States, I was facing a similar situation. I was sort of dean's list, had a good job, had a car, had a cheap place to live, had great circle of friends, spent one semester living there and studying, and was like one of the best students they had and things like that. And then literally over the period of 3 days, I decided that's not what I want to do. It's not worth staying for the other 3.5 years. I'm off to Canada. And on each of those occasions, the choice of my heart overthrew or overruled the decision of the thinking and the logic in my head, kind of. And I have no regrets whatsoever. Every time I look back, I was like, yes, those were the right choices. I'm super happy to be where I am today because I did what I did at that time.
Right. There's a French philosopher whose name I'm now blanking on. It's 18th century, I think. Was it? Anyway, you can look it up, or your readers can look it up. Who said, "The heart has its reasons that the reasons knows not." Okay, because our emotions are often informed by things that we're not conscious of, even though maybe you could be made conscious of them. But this distinction that people draw between emotion and reason, I mean, traditionally in Western philosophy, there was a complete disjuncture between those two things. Modern discussions of emotions, at least in the Anglosphere, have shown that it's a highly problematic disjuncture, and there are close connections between emotion and reason, which haven't really been recognized in Western philosophy until relatively recently, I think.
Yeah. That's probably a way where the East also has a lot more of an advance of several thousand years on us. But let's go to logic and start and build our kind of conversation there for people who are relatively ignorant or basic in their understanding of logic, like me. For example, let me be honest, as part of my philosophy undergraduate degree, I had to take a formal logic course. And I forget if I got a B plus or an A minus at the time, but I remember that was my lowest grade in philosophy at that time. And I remember thinking, oh boy, I really have to work for this even. Whereas my other philosophy courses were like much, much easier to get an A or an A plus. So that's kind of like my background. So let me start with this. Most people hear the word logic and think Aristotle or math proofs, or even in more sort of a popular culture, Mr. Spock. What is logic really, and what isn't it?
Okay. Look, the word logic gets used by many people in different ways, including philosophers. So the way that Gödel used it is not the way that Aristotle used it. It's not the way that Hegel used it. It's not the way that you used it, by the way, because when you talked about being illogical, in my terms, I'd say what you meant was irrational. And rationality and logic are not the same thing. That will become clear in due course, I hope. But modern logicians have a very particular understanding. So if you speak to modern logicians, they'll tell you something like this. Look, we reason. We reason from things we know to things we don't know to find out things. We reason from things we believe to other consequences which we figure are false, so we change our beliefs. So reasoning has to start from somewhere. These are called premises. And go somewhere. These are called conclusions. And logic is about the relationship between premise and conclusions. So an inference is called valid if the conclusion really does follow from the premise. Now, the logician is not interested in the premises. That's someone else's business. It might be the scientist, the moral philosopher, you get your premises from anywhere. All the logician is interested in is whether, given the premises, the conclusion follows. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So if I say there are 17 people in this room, which is false, does it follow that there are at least 3 people in the room? Answer, yes. Because if there were 17 people in the room, there'd be at least 3, okay? So that follows. Suppose I say there's 1 person in this room, which happens to be true. Does it follow that there are 17 people in the room? And the answer is no. It doesn't follow from that. Okay. So the first inference was valid, even though the premise was false. The second was invalid. And logic is about the study of validity. That's, been a central part of logic for most philosophers who've used the word. Okay, what follows from what is not obvious? Some, Mickey Mouse examples are obvious, like the ones I gave you. But when reasoning gets tough, it's very far from obvious. So the people who reason seriously are mathematicians, lawyers, sometimes doctors, sometimes even philosophers. Right? So when you try and figure out what follows from what and why, you've got to produce some kind of theory about that. And that's a lot of what logicians do. They produce a theory. And logic is not set in stone. Logical theories of what follows from what they started in ancient Greece, ancient India, and they've been evolving now for 2,500 years. So the theories that people have come up with are very different, and sometimes they're incompatible. So in the West, usually Aristotle is considered to be the founder of formal logic, and he produced a theory called syllogistic. We can talk about that if you want, but it's not important at the moment. And that was the dominant theory of what follows from what and why. For a long time, its details changed as logicians got their hands on it, but it dominated thought in Aristotle, in the Arabic medieval world, the Latin medieval world, and even as late as the early 19th century.
So how do we know what's valid? How do we know what follows from what? Because my concern is that, especially once we start talking about multiple logics, like logicians tend to disagree even.
They can.
It seems to me as an outsider, as a non-logician. And their reasoning to me seems to be very foreign, and I really have to struggle with it to begin with. And then once I get to a point where 2 respectable logicians disagree, I am really at a loss. And to me, that shows, at least within myself, there is a breakdown of this flow of what follows from what. I just lose that flow of this follows from that. And how do people get that?
Look, when you create theories of what follows from what, they're theories. Okay? And when you're choosing the right theory, you've got a case of theory choice. So we're now in the philosophy of science. How do you choose the best theory? Take any substantial matter, there are going to be different theories, and you choose the best. This happens in physics, it happens in metaphysics, it happens in ethics, it happens in logic. So the answer is you choose the best logical theory in the way that you choose the best theory of anything. No, it's the methodological criteria, right? The sort of main criterion is going to be adequacy to the data. Let me come back to that. But that on its own is not sufficient, because most theories won't be adequate to all the data, and sometimes they'll be equally good. So you need other criteria. And then you choose things like simplicity, power, not resorting to ad hoc hypotheses, Occam's razor. So these are all standard in the philosophy of science, and they work, when you have a methodological choice. Okay, now the one thing that may appear sort of strange in what I've just said is in physics, it's obvious what the data is. What's the data in logic? Well, I think I can best answer that question by giving you an historical episode. So let's go back to the historical story. As I said, syllogistic, or some version of it, and there are many versions, was the sort of dominant theory in the West for a long time. It changed at the end of the 19th century. Why did it change? Part of the answer is that there was a revolution in methodology because the great logicians or mathematicians started to apply the techniques of mathematics to logic really for the first time. And that hadn't been possible before because the mathematical techniques are those developed in the 19th century, like model theory, combinatorics, axiomatics. They're all really sort of developed in the 19th century. But that's sort of by the by. So what happened was this. The 19th century is actually a fascinating period in mathematics. It's sometimes called the century of rigor because what people now call the foundations of mathematics was in a bit of a mess. Mathematicians reasoned about real numbers, decimals. They reasoned about infinitesimals. Transfinite numbers had just appeared on the scene, but no one really knew what these things were or how to account for them. And the 19th century is really the time when mathematicians struggled to put these things on a firm footing, they're very successful. Okay. So by the end of the century, pretty much everything is well sorted out, except for what mathematicians call natural numbers themselves. So that's the counting numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So mathematicians around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, started to produce theories of what natural numbers are. And the important people here are the German mathematician Gottlob Frege, the British mathematician Bertrand Russell. And so they wanted a theory in the foundations of mathematics. So the whole 19th century had put mathematical reasoning under the microscope. And the most sort of careful people to do this were the people like Frege and Russell. So they examined the kind of mathematical reasoning which you need to do this stuff. And they discovered that syllogistic was not adequate. So they had to invent a whole new system of logic. And it's called classical logic. Classical logic is very misleading. The word classical logic is very misleading because you think classical logic has got something to do with the sort of great classical civilizations of the world, Greece, Egypt, China, India. It hasn't. Okay, it was an invention of the late 19th century by Frege, Russell, and other people. Okay, it's even inconsistent with syllogistic. So they're very different systems, but I said I'd give you this example to talk about where the data comes from. The data look, Frege-Russell logic was soon adopted by the logical community, mainly mathematicians at that time, just because it was so superior to any theory that had gone before. And the data that it answered to was the way that mathematicians reasoned, or mathematicians in the 19th century reasoned. So mathematician reasoning is often pretty good. And so the old theory didn't account for this reasoning, but the modern theory, the classical logic really did. So that was the data that drove that revolution. And it really was revolutionary in logic. Okay. Of course, like any theory, it has problems. And these texts were hardly off the press before logicians were pointing out problems they had. Now, when you have a theory and you have problems, you can try and defuse them with ad hoc hypotheses and so on, stories you tell. That's done everywhere. And a lot of people who thought that Frege and Russell had produced the final and ultimate definitive truth about what follows from what and why were tempted by these moves. But lots of philosophers and logicians thought, well, maybe we can do better. And so what the 20th century has seen is the development of many, many systems which now get called non-classical logic. And there are so many of these. They use exactly the same techniques that mathematical techniques that Frege and Russell used.
Yeah. So then, two questions here to follow up what you said. One is because you said that Frege and Russell invented kind of a new logic to sort of be able to make sense and bring together all the math that happened in the 19th century and the mess of the data and all of this stuff. But the first question is like, is logic invented or discovered? It's kind of like a similar question towards math, because some people...
What I've been talking about are theories, and theories are invented. Okay, now what they are theories about is a different question. And one might well ask, is the topic of what your theory is about a partial construction or a discovery? And that may well depend on what you're theorizing about. Most people who are scientists will think that the topic of your scientific theories is reality, and reality is not a conceptual invention. Now, neutrons and so on are out there.
Yes.
That hasn't been a universal view. Some famous philosophers like Kant have thought that reality is partially a conceptual construction. It's not out there, it's partly in here. So there can be disagreements even about science, okay? And when it comes to things like ethics, it gets even more complicated. The situation in logic is that there are different views on this. Some people think that what follows from what is kind of out there and is sort of fixed, maybe by meanings of words or rules of practice or something. Views about that differ. Some people think that logic is some kind of social construction. Okay, that's a view. So once you start talking, if you're talking about theories, they're clearly constructions. When you talk about what their theories of logic are theories of, that's a much more contentious view, and philosophers and logicians will sort of disagree on that.
Yeah, I would venture to guess that the public perception, for good or for bad, is that, like me, it is presumed that logic is kind of out there, and we're kind of like getting a glimpse in a moment of enlightenment of it. And then we're able to generalize it with our theory or support our theory with it. That's kind of like the general presumption. But
it's a view. It's not universally shared. I mean, the debates about this go all over the place. But let me put this very crudely. There tends to be, in contemporary European philosophy, by which I also include Anglo philosophy, a split between people who have a sort of scientific training and people who have a literary training. So sometimes people distinguish between analytic philosophy and content philosophy. They're terrible names, but they're pretty standard. And most people in the Anglosphere, the analytic philosophers, if they have some kind of training outside philosophy, it's in science or mathematics. Whereas most people who come through a European education have a much more literary education. And this is a sweeping and crass generalization, but it'll do for the moment. People who have this scientific education tend to have the kind of view that you indicated.
yes.
People who have a literary education tend to have the opposite view. Okay. Now, that doesn't tell you who's right, of course, but it tells you something that it tells you that there is a split in views, and in part that's to do with the kind of education you've received outside philosophy.
Yeah, and I remember even when I was doing my undergrad at the Department of Philosophy, 25 years ago, in North America, people commonly looked down on the sort of European school.
That's true. And let me tell you, vice versa. So people educated in Europe in those days looked down upon the nitpicking nature of Anglo philosophy. Um, look, both so-called analytic philosophy and so-called European philosophy have strengths and weaknesses. And there's good and bad philosophers on both sides of that split. What we're now seeing, and this is a kind of sociological comment, is that division is disappearing. And there are increasing number of philosophers who are crossing the divide. We can recognize or try to recognize good philosophy, philosophical insight, wherever it comes from. And that might be in Germany, it might be in the UK. That division is slowly disappearing. And there's a much bigger division that's disappearing, and that's between Eastern and Western philosophy, because the root things that Western philosophers said about the Eastern traditions were much more, vehement than what they said about what Anglo philosophers said about European philosophy. It wasn't just that it was bad philosophy, it wasn't philosophy. Now that's crazy, because if you read the text, you will see they are philosophy. But that division is slowly being overcome too. In the West, it was overcome a century ago in the East for different reasons. But so we're actually, sorry, this is kind of rambling a little bit, but let me just finish where this major thought is going. Thought is majorly going. We're really in a time when philosophy is becoming globalized for the first time. And we can realize all the world's great philosophical traditions. We recognize they've all got points of insight. There are things to learn from all of them. And so now philosophers are studying a lot of great world traditions in philosophy, and not bringing sort of cultural, even sort of misguided racist views to philosophy for the first time.
Yeah. But the bottom line here, perhaps interesting and maybe shocking, or at least it was shocking to me when our friend Tim Beeler brought that point to me after an interview I did a couple of months ago, was that there are many different kinds of logics that exist today.
Yes.
So how many are there, and is the number still growing? Because that was an absolute mind blower to me.
Right. Look, it depends. For a logician, a logic is simply a mathematical structure of a certain kind. Okay. How many structures like that are there? There's an uncountable infinity. Okay, that's the quick mathematical answer. But of course, not all those are serious. Not all those are serious candidates for systems which govern the way we actually, the correct way of reasoning. Okay, let me just interject that I've made a distinction between how people actually reason and the correct way of reasoning. That's important because logicians, at least modern logicians, do not study how people actually reason. That's the domain of cognitive psychologists. And what we know from studies in cognitive psychology is that people often reason very badly.
Right.
So logicians study how you ought to reason. And of course, we make assumptions about who the good reasoners are. Mathematicians, usually lawyers, maybe. Okay, so to return to what I was saying before, how many systems of logic are there which might plausibly be taken to govern the way we ought to reason? And look, you will find in the literature nowadays defenders of maybe 10, a dozen different kinds of logical systems for that purpose.
Yeah.
Classical logic is one of them.
Sorry?
classical logic is one of them,
Yes.
and probably that's still that's probably still the orthodox view. So if you do a course in Logic 100 anywhere in the world nowadays, you will study classical logic. But lots of people think that's only a very crude, simple approximation. But there are good reasons for teaching it. Look, if you want to learn quantum mechanics, theory of relativity, you don't start off teaching people that. You start off teaching them Newtonian dynamics or mechanics, because that's where you meet the techniques in their simplest form. So you teach them the simple techniques, and then you go on to something more adequate. So some people think that classical logic is correct. A lot of people think, well, it's very simple. So let's master some simple techniques there. Then we'll do some things which are a bit more complicated but more adequate.
Right, but there was another element there too, at least at the time when I was in school. Again, that's old story, 25 years ago, but at the time I started modern formal logic, or that was the name of the course to the best of my recollection. And we probably kind of barely touched on Boolean logic and fuzzy logic, but everything else was either considered sacrilege almost, or an insult to our intelligence, or kind of a perversion of logic, if you will. And I'm sorry to put it that way, but so at the time, if I had gone to my professor and have told him, look, there's 11 other logics out there than the one you're teaching us today, I think I might have been failed in that class, because his attitude was like, this is how logic works.
Oh. Yeah, look, there's you're right. There was that attitude. It must be said that most logicians have no understanding of the history of logic to see how our theories have changed, because logic, like a lot of in the Anglosphere. I mean, I presume you studied in the Anglosphere.
University of Toronto.
Yeah. Okay. So philosophy and logic in the Anglosphere has always been done very ahistorically, unlike Europe. So they tend to think that what you have now is the right story, end of story. Okay. And this happens in other areas. If you'd taken a course in quantum mechanics and said, well, I don't really believe this stuff, your physics teacher would have said, well, this is what we think is the right theory, just learn the bloody thing. So there's a very excellent American philosopher of science called Tom Kuhn, who wrote a book called Structure of Scientific Revolutions.
Yes.
And he paints a fascinating picture of science. It's not right in many ways, but one thing he does is draw a distinction between normal science and revolutionary science. Okay, normal science is when there's a generally agreed correct theory, and you learn that, and you learn to operate within it. And then when it starts to break down, then you figure you've got to do something else, and science moves into a period of revolutionary science. Okay, so you can apply that to areas other than science. And what you're sort of describing is a period in the Anglosphere when logic was in a period of normal science. There was a general speaking assumption that Frege and Russell had got it right. Frege had brought down the tablets of stone from Mount Jena saying, this is how you do logic. Just, fill in the ones and zeros. It might be strange, but, this is the correct way to do it. So that was very much a period of normal science, and it may not be entirely over, but we're very well aware of the limitations of classical logic now, much more than they were in that period. And so there's a lot more hesitancy now about the correctness of classical logic, not so much amongst people who teach it, but people who are logicians, because often the people who teach logic are not logicians, right? It works like this in the US and probably in Canada too. Logic's a very technical subject, and you often can't afford to appoint a dedicated logician because it's a very specialist atmosphere or subject. So what you do is you haven't really got a logician to teach logic. So you choose some poor bastard, usually the person who's the most junior appointment, and say, you're going to teach it. They're not logicians. And what they do is they grab a textbook off the shelf and they teach that. And of course, they're not logicians, so they just regurgitate what the textbook says. But logicians have always known there are real problems with classical logic.
Mm-hmm.
But again, what I've just said is a sweeping generalization. So, it's not as cut and dry as I said. But generally speaking, professional logicians are much more aware of the problems of dominant theories than people who are simply asked to teach logic.
Well, let me take two sidetracks here for a moment, and then we'll come back and dive deeper into this, into the meat of the matter of logic and all the different types. But first is a kind of a marketing thing, perhaps, and you tell me, is fuzzy logic in things like rice cookers mostly marketing, or is there real logic behind that fuzzy rice cooker? Because some of the best rice cookers in the Zojirushi rice cooker line, and even in the Korean brand, which I forget the name, Koko, I forget the Korean brand name now, but the Japanese one is very famous and expensive. And, you traveled across the East, and you know how they revere rice over there and how picky they are about getting the rice perfect. So they even have a model named after fuzzy logic rice cooking. Is that marketing, or is there something of substance which would also tell us that there is actual real world application or implication of that kind of logic?
Look, I don't know what these words mean when they're applied to a rice cooker. Okay. So I'd have to know more about how fuzziness is implemented in these things. My suspicion is it's mainly hype. Let me tell you how a logician understands fuzzy logic. In many systems of logic, including classical logic, there's truth, there's falsity, both. There's not both, there's not neither, just two values, end of story. Now, fuzzy logic, in a logician's terms, is a logic where you have a continuum of truth values.
In other words, the distinction is perhaps one of being black and white and the other of shades of gray.
Yeah. So in fuzzy logic, in mathematical terms, every real number between 0 and 1 is a truth value. So something can be 0.3 true, 0.75 true, even true to degree 1 over pi. It makes a formal sense. Now, if you do that, then there's always a question of how you handle matters of degree. And making a cutoff in matters of degree is always arbitrary in a certain sense, but in practice, you often have to make cutoffs. Now, my guess is that when you apply fuzzy logic to rice cookers, if you do, what you do is you don't just say the power is on or off. The voltage comes by degrees, right? You have some kind of rheostat. And so what you do is you adjust the voltage to some measure between 0 and 1, between totally on 1, totally off 0, and then you do that kind of thing. That's not really an application of logic. It's more a recognition of the fact that sometimes it's better to work by degrees. But as I say, I don't know how fuzzy rice cookers work, so that's just my guess.
Right. All I know is that it's a highly rated rice cooker, and it's often given as the best value rice cooker out of the line because the other ones are way too expensive, and this one is supposed to be the best bang for the money.
Yeah. Well, if you cook, you don't just turn the gas on to turn it off, right? If you're cooking a meal, you adjust the flame for the various things you want to do when you cook. Of course, cooking is an analog process. It's not a digital process.
Right, but I have often this kind of discussion with my wife, actually, because I cook at home and stuff like that, and One thing that kind of always blows my mind is when I get in the car after she's driven, it's like the air conditioning is either fully blast on or fully off. And when she's cooking, I try to tell her, it's either on 10 or on 1. And I'm trying to tell her, look, you can modulate here. It's like you can put it on 4, you can put it on 5. You don't have to have it on 10. You don't have to have it on 1. You can do the in between. So.
Yeah, look, I rather suspect that I'd prefer to taste your cooking to your wife's.
Yeah, most people say that too, though. In her credit, after 25 years, 23 years together, she's gotten so much better. It took 20 years to start cooking soup, so that was a big progress in our family, and I'm very grateful for it. But let me go back to another topic here. The connection between logic, story, and possibility. And that's kind of a result of my conversation with Professor Angus Fletcher, after whose interview Tim Bieler actually suggested that I bring you here for a conversation. So let me give you 2 quotes, and you tell me how you take them as a logician. So the first one is this: logic computes what is probable, while story creates what is possible. Probable is a pattern that has occurred before, but possible is an event that has never happened yet, but could. And the other quote is this: innovation creates what's new. Logic calculates what's true. And there is nothing new about truth. Truth is timeless.
Yeah. Look, those 2 quotes are seriously misleading, I'm afraid. Let's take them one by one. Okay. Possibility and probability are quite different things. Possibility. Logicians and philosophers have used the notion of possibility since the origins of philosophy in the West. Okay. And they've theorized about how you reason about various different kinds of possibility. There's logical possibility, metaphysical possibility, physical possibility, dialectic possibility. The fact that there are so many different notions of possibility is sort of much better understood now than it was in the Middle Ages, for example, when people were still struggling to get the different notions straight. But logicians have always investigated inferences that use the notion of possibility. Going back to Aristotle. Now, in modern logic, there is a branch of logic called modal logic, which deals with inferences that involve notions of possibility, sometimes called rather cutely possible world semantics, because that's sort of the technology it uses, but that's a sort of metaphor. And now this is a branch of logic. Some people call it non-classical because it's not dealt with in Logic 100. Some people call it classical because it just extends the logic you learn in Logic 100. So, whether it's classical or non-classical, you might have a debate about. But it's a very well-developed branch of modern logic. And there are many systems of modal logic, and they're relatively well understood. Okay, that's possibility. Probability is quite different. Probability wasn't really studied until, I guess, the late 17th, early 18th century.
Blaise Pascal or something.
Yeah, and it arose first out of studying games of chance, like card games and dice games, because
Yes.
people want to know how to gamble efficiently.
Right.
Of course, it's gone a long way since then. And now probability theory gets applied all over the place in modern statistical investigations, in quantum mechanics, you name it. I mean, it's applied everywhere. And there is a kind of standard theory of probability. It's governed by something called the Kolmogorov axioms, because Kolmogorov was a 20th century Russian mathematician who really works on formalizing it. And what everyone agrees is that probabilities come by degrees. So you need a calculus in which statements have a probability value, which can be any number between 0 and 1, at least in standard probability theory. Aside, do not confuse that with fuzzy logic, because in fuzzy logic, things have a truth value between 0 and 1, but probabilities behave completely differently from fuzzy truth values. So sometimes people are confused about that. I'll explain to you why if you like, but take my word for it for the moment. Now probability theory is very standard. You'll learn it if you study mathematics or statistics at a university. And modal logic is very, very different from probability theory. Okay. So that was the first quote.
Yeah, and basically the implication of the first quote is that logic computes what is probable while story creates what is possible. And therefore logic is limited, but story allows us to go beyond logic. That's the implication for me.
Yeah. Look, there's a sort of truth in that, but it's not very well phrased. Look, a traditional view is that logic deals with what is possible in some sense of possibility, maybe logical possibility. Whereas when you tell stories, you're not bound by possibility any more than dreams are, okay? All sorts of impossible things can happen. You can have a perfectly coherent story in which what happens is impossible. There are such stories. They're well known. I even wrote one at one time.
Mark Twain noted that, the difference between fiction and reality is that fiction has to be probable, I think, or possible, whereas reality does.
Fiction does not have to be possible. There's lots of fictions in which the impossible happens, in any sense of impossibility, right? If you're reading Dickens, of course it's possible. If you're reading, I don't know, Borges, then it isn't. So impossible fictions are standard, right? Whereas a standard assumption was that logic deals with possibility. Now, that's no longer true because there are logics which concern impossible worlds. I told you that modal logic uses possible worlds, right? For a long time, all logics that dealt with modality had only possible worlds. But nowadays, logicians also deal with impossible worlds. So it's not even true to say that logic deals only with possibilities anymore. Yeah, so logic is evolving. It's been changing for 2,500 years, and we're in a state of very dramatic change, and have been for the last 100 years. So, people who make remarks like that are not logicians. They don't really know what's happening. They have a view of logic that might be, I don't know, out of date, let's just say.
I see. And
Right.
what about the second quote, that
Remind me what the second quote was.
Innovation creates what's new, logic calculates what's true, and there is nothing new about truth because truth is timeless.
Yeah, look, so many things that need qualification there. Look, logicians create new things. They create new theories. We talked about Frege and Russell. They created new theories, right? So logic can create new things. Logicians can create new things. Does logic get at the truth? Only if the truth is about what follows from what. Because the truth in physics is someone else's business. It's not logicians. So if logicians are concerned with truth, it's truth in a very limited domain. It's truth in what follows from what. Now, is truth timeless? Okay, now that's a big question. In one sense, it obviously isn't. Okay, I say it's not raining or it's not snowing. Okay, it's not snowing. That's true in New York now. It wasn't true in New York a week ago. So the truth has changed. Okay. So statements like that use words which logicians call indexicals. They depend on the context, and the context can involve the time, the place, the person. And if something involves a reference to time, like the word now, then of course that can change as now changes. So, so that's one important distinction. But set that aside. Let's suppose that you're considering things without indexicals, such as 2 + 2 is 4. There are quarks. All right. Now, at least a common view amongst scientifically trained philosophers would be that those truths don't change. Of course, what we believe to be true does change. That's a given, right? So that's a view about truth in the ballpark of something that's called realism. Reality and truth are person independent. And that's a very standard view, but it's not by any means a universally agreed upon view, especially when you look at sort of philosophers in the European tradition, but even some in the Anglo tradition, like William James and Dewey, who tend to identify truth with verifiability. What is true is what's verified. Now, if you're a realist, you're going to say, well, there are lots of things that are true we've never verified. Is there life on a planet in another galaxy? It's either true or false. It's unverified. So a realist will say, of course, there are lots of things which are true but unverified, or false or unverified. But verificationists about truth will identify truth with verification. So something can be unverified at a certain time and verified later. History of science is full of that. And if you identify truth with verification, then truth can change because what's verified changes. Now, there have been some very influential verificationist philosophers in the 20th century, and they're not Europeans, or at least not continental philosophers. There's the mathematical logician, Brouwer, who was Dutch. There are the logical positivists, who are Austrian. There is Michael Dummett, who was working in Oxford. These are all sort of verificationists. The debate between realists and verificationists is a major debate in philosophy. So to say that truth is changeless really depends on your theory of truth, and that's highly contentious.
Mm-hmm. So then the implication here in terms of logic would be something like this. Does logic merely describe reality as it already is, or can certain logics actually expand the space of what's possible to think, imagine, and create?
Well, the final part of your question concerns cognitive psychology, and I'm not really qualified to talk about that because people imagine all kinds of things, whether or not they know logic. Okay, so I'm not sure that it has any real bearing on that. Do our theories concern? Let me put it a different way. This takes us back to a previous stage of the conversation. Logic is a theory of what follows from what. Okay. To say that this follows from that is to make a claim that we take to be true. Is the truth of a realist kind or of a verificationist kind or a conceptual kind? And, different logicians have held different views about this. So the views of Frege were very different from the views of Michael Dummett, this Oxford philosopher that I mentioned. So there isn't a standard answer to that question, I'm afraid.
Because I think many people, again, would presume that logic would be a tool to let us glimpse or at least get closer to reality, or what Einstein would have called the mind of God, maybe.
Yeah. Look, logic is a tool. We've talked about this. And one thing a tool is very good at is figuring out what's true given other things you believe is true. So, Einstein came up with the general theory of relativity, and he predicted that light rays bend. And Eddington did a very famous experiment to verify that they do in the 1920s, I think. So Einstein's theory taught us something about reality. It taught us that light rays bend. So we learned truths by inferring consequences from Einstein's theory. Of course, he used logic. He wasn't a logician, but of course he inferred. His inferences were mainly mathematical, but that's okay. That's inference too. So you can certainly use inference to find out things about reality. Of course you can.
Okay, let's move on to paradox, nonsense, and contradiction. So let's start with paradox. What is paradox? And is it a failure of reasoning, for example, as many would say, or a clue about reality, or what is it anyway?
Yeah, look, here's a rough and ready distinction of paradox. It comes from the Greek meaning beyond belief, okay? And a paradox is an argument. And it's an argument which starts off with things which you believe or seem pretty self-evident and takes you to something that is really hard to believe because it doesn't seem right. The conclusion is beyond belief, right? That's a paradox. Now, paradoxes are of many kinds. Look, they go by the two kinds go by different names, but in one kind of paradox, you double down on the premises and you figure out that the conclusion might have been beyond belief, but it's true. And you just learned something really interesting. So, for example, lots of people till the end of the 19th century thought that there was only one size of infinity, if indeed it made sense to talk about the size of infinity at all. But arguments there were different size of infinity go back to at least late Greek logic. So they knew these arguments, but they couldn't believe the conclusions. Then along comes the great German mathematician Georg Cantor, who actually proved there are different sizes of infinity. So these arguments that have been known for nearly 2,000 years actually showed something that was true. It's just that we didn't realize it. So that's one kind of paradox. As another kind of paradox, according to which the conclusion of the paradox really is unacceptable. Okay, in that case, something must have gone wrong with the argument. Because if it's valid, then if the conclusion ain't true, there must be something wrong with one of the premises. And then the name of the game is, well, what's wrong with the premise? Which premise is wrong and why? So take Zeno's paradoxes, another very famous bunch of paradoxes from ancient Greece. Zeno's paradoxes, well, at least one of them, for example, let's just focus on one of them, was that nothing moves. Now that conclusion is crazy, okay? No one will think, well, things don't really move, we just didn't realize it, or at least that's a very implausible view. So there's got to be something wrong with Zeno's arguments. And the question is, well, what? Okay. So it may not be obvious when you are presented with a paradox which of those two kinds it is. Further investigation is required. But I think probably the most famous paradoxes are ones which people think there's something wrong with the argument. So it's a paradox of the second kind. And then the name of the game is, well, explain what's wrong with it. And then, it's about something, motion, truth, infinity. You decide that by having a theory of that thing and trying to figure out what the best theory is.
Okay, so we had a bit of a technical interruption here momentarily, but let's pick up our conversation from the idea of paradox that we've touched upon and the types thereof. Why does classical logic treat contradictions or paradoxes, if that's fair to say, as catastrophic? And does it? Or is that just my perception?
Yes. No, your perception is largely accurate. And there is a very specific reason. So, in classical logic, and a number of non-classical logics too, there's a principle of inference called explosion. Actually, it's been known since the Middle Ages, so as you might guess, it has a Latin name. In Latin, it's called ex contradictione quodlibet sequitur, or sequitur quodlibet. From a contradiction, anything follows. And it says once you've got a contradiction, everything follows from it, right? So here's an example of an explosive inference. Donald Trump is corrupt. Donald Trump is not corrupt. So the Earth has 17 moons. Or the next train from here to Boston goes at 11:16. The next train from here to Boston goes at 12:45. So oxygen, water contains nitrogen. Those inferences are valid inferences of valid examples of explosion. And if you tell someone who's never studied logic that they're valid, they'll go, "What? Of course it isn't, because there's no connection between the premise and the conclusion. You know, the times of trains from here to Boston's got nothing to do with the constitution of water." So it can come as rather a surprise to people when they study Logic 100 that that's valid in classical logic. Okay, now you might well ask why, and actually it's not as stupid as it sounds. We can go into that if you want, but it is a bit more plausible than it appears initially. Okay. If you subscribe to that principle, then of course, if your theory is inconsistent, everything follows. And so disaster happens. That's why the principle is called explosion, because once you've got inconsistent information, everything follows. And a theory that tells you everything is useless, right? So if you ask a modern logician what's wrong with an inconsistent theory, that's the first thing they're likely to tell you. All right. Now, at least since the 1940s, 50s, there's been a study of modern logics which do not validate explosion. They go by a technical name called paraconsistent logics. And there are many paraconsistent logics. The family of paraconsistent logics is just one family of non-classical logics. And so now we know what logics which don't validate explosion are like. And again, this brings us back to an earlier stage of the discussion. How do you know whether a paraconsistent logic or a non-paraconsistent logic is like? Well, you got different theories, and then you use some theory choice. And one of the things that might be an issue here is how you handle the liar paradox. Because if your theory of truth, which is the lie, concerns the liar paradox, has to make all kinds of ad hoc moves to do justice to the reasoning, that's a very black mark against your theory of truth. And a paraconsistent theory of truth can be very, very simple. So it might turn out that, an inconsistent theory of truth is exactly what you want. But this is one of the things that feeds into a discussion of the right choice of logic. It's not the only thing, but it's one thing.
All right. So perhaps now is the time to go into contradiction and dialetheism and perhaps break down the liar paradox. So a modern version, perhaps, of the liar paradox would sound something like, I'm telling you the truth that I'm a liar. So, on the one hand, if I'm telling you the truth, I wouldn't be a liar. And on the other hand, if I'm a liar, Is that a good example? Let me think again.
Yeah, look, that's not quite the best way of putting it, because if I say I'm a liar, if I say I'm a liar, I could actually be telling you the truth. I mean, we call someone a liar if they habitually lie, but I could just be having a moment of candidness and telling you that I normally lie, but I could be telling you the truth about that. So that's not quite the right way of putting it, but it's the
Okay,
right
how would
idea.
you do it?
Right, the standard way is this. Let's play a game. Is the next thing I say true? Delhi is in India.
Yes.
Okay. Is the next thing I say true? Um, uh, Beijing is in
No.
Australia. Okay. Now, is the next thing I say true? What I'm now saying is false.
um. Yeah. Yes and no.
That's the liar paradox. Okay. And why you're hesitating is that this thinking process was going through your head. What I've just said is false. Okay. Suppose it's true. Well, it says it's false. So if it's true, it's false. But if it's false, well, it's just said it's false. So what it's saying is true. So if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. That's the liar paradox, right? And that goes back to Eubulides in the, or it was 4th century BCE. But it's just one example of a kind. I mean, it can sound like a logician's party game, right? And if you don't know the logic, you'd be forgiven for thinking that's exactly what it is, but it's not. So this is one of a whole family of paradoxes of which use self-reference, which turned up in the foundations of mathematics around the time of the revolution in logic.
It's a mental knot, and around the same time of, chronologically speaking, of that era, and that's what that brings me to, by the way, is kind of Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, which is full of moments where logic seems completely mad, and like the queen declaring the sentence first, the verdict afterwards, and like,
Yep.
are those jokes in Lewis Carroll, by the way, meaningful in any way in terms of logic? Do they reveal any hidden assumptions and limits of classical logic?
Look, Carroll was a mathematician, and he was no mean logician. So he actually wrote on various papers on logic and syllogistic. I mean, he's before the revolution in logic, but he knows what I'm saying. Now, the Alice stories are kind of interesting because they're full of jokes, right? Those jokes are often philosophical jokes, um, uh, or linguistic jokes. Um, so let's just take one very simple example. The Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Um, I forget the exact details, but Alice says, "Well, can we have scones or something?" And the Mad Hatter says, "No, we'll have scones tomorrow." And then the Hare says, "Okay, yeah, we always have scones tomorrow, so we never have them." This is a joke because tomorrow is one of these indexical words, right? And what Alice is asking about is the actual day that follows, whereas the Hare is making a pun on, the fact that the referent of tomorrow changes every day. All right. So there are lots of jokes like this in Alice. And uh, because of his philosophical interest, Carroll often took these sort of philosophical things and made jokes about them.
Hello, Graham. We had a bit of a technical interruption last time, so we have to pick up our conversation again on another day. And I want to thank you very much for your flexibility and your generosity of time to continue this conversation with us. So last time we managed to finish touching upon Alice of Wonderland and Lewis Carroll's logical jokes. And we were just about going into dialetheism. So why don't we pick up our conversation from there? What is dialetheism? What does it mean? And how does it help us face or even perhaps resolve or deal with contradictions?
Okay. So the word dialetheism is a neologism. It was made up by myself and my sadly deceased friend Richard Silvan, as he became many years ago now, many decades ago now. And a dialetheia is just a neologism for a true contradiction. Something of the form P and not P that's true. You know, it's raining and it's not raining, Trump's wise and Trump's not wise, all men are mortal, some men are not mortal, you know. And dialetheism is the view that there are such things. So the view is that some contradictions are true. It doesn't tell you which ones are true. That's an obvious next question, but we can go there in a minute. But dialetheism flies in the face of a principle that's been very orthodox in Western philosophy. The situation in Eastern philosophy is not quite the same. We can talk about that if you want, but let's just stick to Western philosophy for the moment. So there's a famous, somewhat notorious passage in Aristotle in the Metaphysics where he says, hey, you just can't accept a contradiction, can't possibly be true. And then he has a bunch of arguments that defend it. Now, the arguments are not terribly good, to be honest, and that's not just my view, that's the view of modern commentators on the passage. But for all that, they set the principle of non-contradiction, you just can't have a contradiction, into orthodoxy in Western philosophy. Now, there have been people who dissented from this. The most obvious example is Hegel, although my claim that he was a dialetheist will make some Hegel scholars froth at the mouth, but we can go into that if you want. But with the rare exceptions aside, virtually every Western philosopher since Aristotle has assumed that it's impossible for contradictions to be true. So dialetheism flies in the face of that principle. And there are a number of modern dialetheists, I'm one, and it's a view that's been explored and continues to be explored really since about the 1970s. Okay, so that was the first part of your question. Now, why should one be interested in that, especially since it's
What does it mean before we get to why? Let's talk about what a little more. What does it mean?
Dialetheism is the view that some contradictions are true.
Because you said it's a neologism, but you didn't explain what it stands for. So I just wanted to make it clear. So,
okay. So a dialetheia is a true contradiction, and dialetheism is the view that some contradictions are true.
Wonderful. Okay, so why should we care then if some contradictions are true? And how do we make it possible to differentiate between contradictions which are not true and contradictions which are true?
Yeah. Okay. Why you might care is because that it helps with certain problems. So there are certain arguments that seem to end in contradiction, most often paradoxical arguments. Now, we talked about paradox last time, did we not?
Yes.
Okay. So there are some paradoxical arguments which end in a contradiction. And probably the most famous of these is the liar paradox, which we can talk about if you like.
We touched upon it last time.
Okay. So it's always been assumed in the history of Western philosophy that this is a paradox where something must have gone wrong with the argument which ends in a contradiction. But the view of some modern dialetheists is that that's the wrong way to approach the paradox. The paradox is of the other kind that I mentioned, namely where it just establishes something that might seem to be rather surprising, but in the end, you have to accept it. And there are various reasons for this, but perhaps one of the most telling is the fact that all attempts to say what's wrong with the lie paradox argument have so far, in the last 2,500 years, have been unsuccessful, at least if consensus is a mark of success. Because after 2,500 years of discussing this, there's still no consensus about what's wrong with the arguments. Mm-hmm. And the dialetheist move in this case is there's nothing wrong with the arguments. They just establish something rather surprising, namely, or that might have surprised you, namely there are true contradictions. Okay. And more generally, let me say this because your next question is going to feed into it. When we face various philosophical issues, we have to theorize. So theorization is ubiquitous in human inquiry. We theorize in physics, we theorize in biology, we theorize in history, we theorize in metaphysics, we theorize in ethics, and we theorize in logic. So when we theorize, it's because the answer is not at all obvious. And we have a bunch of theories on the table, and this may change over time as we invent new theories. And then at any time, it's rational to choose which is the best theory. Okay. How do you do that? Well, now, let me come back to that in due course, but I just wanted to lay the ground for addressing your next question, which was, how do you know? Okay. So if I say some contradictions are true, and you say, well, okay, so give me a criterion for deciding which ones are true, or at least which ones it's possible such they're true, and which ones there aren't. Now, as you might guess, I'm often asked that question. And my first response is, can sound like a smart-ass reply. Tell me how you know whether anything is true. Okay, of course, that's a hard question. And that gets to the very root of deep questions in epistemology.
Well, maybe one way would be to confirm the same result in at least two independent ways.
Well, that is part of a more general approach. The more general approach was specified by the great Scottish 18th century philosopher David Hume, who said, you apportion your beliefs according to the evidence. So if there's evidence that something is true, then, okay, it's rational to believe it. And if there's no evidence, then you're pretty silly to believe it because that's just gullibility, right? So this is a view about when it's rational to accept anything as true. It's not a magic bullet for determining whether something's true, because it says, hey, you've just got to see what the evidence is. And that's always going to be on a case-by-case basis. So how do you determine whether anything is true? You look at the evidence. How do you determine whether contradiction is true? You look at the evidence. All right. Now, take the liar paradox. Then the sort of flat-footed answer to what is the evidence, well, it's just that there's this argument which ends in a contradiction, and all the premises look good, all the steps of inference look good, and no one yet has been able to provide a very convincing argument as to what's wrong with this argument. Okay, so that's the sort of very simple answer. but it's more complicated than that, because when you are trying to solve the liar paradox concerns truth. And what you're actually doing is formulating a theory of truth, which is, of course, not easy. And in general, in any complex situation, to solve any question, you have to formulate theories. In this case, it's a theory of truth, but it might be a theory of dynamics. It might be a theory of, I don't know, what happened in the 17th century in history. It might be a theory of what the right thing to do is in general. I mean, and then we've got a bunch of theories on the table, as I said, and you choose the best one. So coming back to the liar again, you want the best theory of truth. Now, how do you choose the best theory? And this brings us back to your suggestion that you must have, at least it's good to have independent arguments, okay? Which is certainly true.
And the more the better.
Yeah. But this takes us to a debate in the philosophy of science about theory choice. Now, the most important criterion for a good theory is that it's adequate to the data. Or, when you theorize, there are certain things you're trying to explain, and you do really want your theory to explain the data that you're given. And that's true, but that won't take you anywhere near far enough for at least two reasons. The first is that most theories will have a problem with at least some of the data. So this is something that philosophers of science such as Kuhn and Popper and Feyerabend and Lakatos emphasized. So there are always going to be problems. So there are issues about some of the data that doesn't fit. The other problem is the sort of converse of that. You might just have two theories which are equally good on the data. And there are cases of that in the history of science too. So adequacy to the data is not sufficient on its own. And then we need other criteria as well. And there's a whole bunch of these which are pretty standard in the philosophy of science. And they're things like simplicity, unifying power, refusal to use ad hoc hypotheses, Occam's razor. There's this whole bunch of criteria. And the sort of standard story in the philosophy of science is you choose the rational theory to believe is the one which is overall best on these criteria. That's a bit vague. You can make it more precise, but that'll do for the moment. So you've got this raft of criteria, and the rational theory to believe is the one that does overall best on this raft of criteria. And if your theory is inconsistent, which it could be, then it will tell you that some contradictions are true. So finally, I've got around to answering your question, which is, how do you know which ones are? Well, the ones that are rationally believed to be true are the ones that are delivered by your best theory of whatever topic is at issue.
What if the theory is wrong? I mean, shouldn't we...
All theories could be wrong.
Yeah, so shouldn't we just adjust the theory rather than presume that the contradiction is true?
Why?
Well, because if we have data which is inconsistent with our theory, maybe the theory is wrong.
Look, every theory is possibly wrong. That's the general lesson of the history of science, of philosophy, or ethics, or history. Most theories can be wrong. Now, you might want to say that, well, inconsistency is a bad mark against a theory. Okay, so is lack of simplicity, but we sometimes accept theories that are not simple. If you're going to say inconsistency, end of story, that is because you're endorsing the principle of non-contradiction. Okay, why should you do that? Why is this an inviolable principle? Okay, well, if you accept Aristotle's arguments, that's a good reason. The trouble is that Aristotle's arguments are terrible. And no one has really come up with a better argument since Aristotle. So let me put it sort of dogmatically. the endorsement of the principle of non-contradiction itself appears a bit of historical dogma. I mean, we've overturned virtually everything else in Aristotle. Why hang on to this?
Let me put it in a little bit different way. How did you discover that contradictions are true for yourself? Was there a moment or was there a story behind it? Because, I mean, I don't know what the context was when you got to that point, but, you know, we have 2,500 years of history, maybe dogmatic, but they carried the day. And that's pretty hefty weight behind a theory or, you know, an axiom or whatever you want to call it, or a principle. And then here is Graham Priest, not even really a philosopher, predominantly a mathematician, who then went into philosophy, and somehow, instead of going with the 2,500 years before you, you go, no, this is actually true. This is actually a true contradiction. So instead of fighting it like everyone else did for 2,500 years, let's just embrace it.
Okay, that's a fair question. Look, first of all, let me remind you that there are voices in the history of Western philosophy who have demurred from the principle of non-contradiction, like Hegel. So it wasn't unprecedented. And what happened for me was this. I was trained as a logician, and I was trained in classical logic, as most logicians, at least in my time, were. But the history of logic in the 20th century is deeply embroiled with how you deal with paradox, particularly the liar paradox, and other famous arguments in mathematical logic which deal with self-reference. And the most famous is Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So any logician must understand and be able to operate with such theorems and such procedures, and I was no exception. And so I didn't do my doctorate on this, but in my doctorate I started to engage with how you handle paradoxes, what Gödel's first theorem tells us, and particularly what his proof tells us, and things like that. And I started to feel very uncomfortable with what orthodoxy there was in these matters. Because, as I've said, you know, the standard accounts of how you treat these things, like the liar paradox, really weren't very satisfactory, as far as I could see. And so it occurred to me to wonder, well, you know, maybe we've just been barking up the wrong tree. Maybe these paradoxical arguments do establish what they appear to, namely that some contradictions are true. And I thought, well, let's explore that possibility, see what happens. I mean, at one time it was just an idea, but it was worth investigating. So I started to investigate how you handle contradictions, what that does to logic, what it does to these arguments in mathematical logic, what it does to all kinds of things. So I started to investigate. And I thought the idea was crazy. Every time I would give a talk on this stuff, I'd think to myself, well, look, there must be something wrong with the idea. Someone, sooner or later, is going to, you know, I give a talk, someone at the back of the audience is going to put their hand up and say, yeah, but Graham, what about? And I go, oh, yes, my God, that's obvious, I've missed it. And for 10 years, I thought this was going to happen, and it never did. So after 10 years, I thought, well, maybe the idea is not so crazy after all. I mean, there's certainly an element of what you might call temerity in my sort of going against the grain, as it were. But then...
And risk-taking.
Yeah.
Basically...
young people take risks.
Yeah, putting your reputation on an idea. And, you know, that's how careers are built and destroyed in academia.
Yeah, well, I didn't have a reputation, so I had nothing much to lose. But I took a risk. But the more I sort of investigated, the more I looked at the consequences, more I looked at the mechanisms for handling contradictions, the more I looked at the applications of dialetheism, the more and more I became convinced that there was something in this.
Okay, but how do you deal with like my audience, my engineer audience members who would tell you, listen, Graham, they'd be like, I did several keynote speeches for the Danish Engineering Society. And, they're very smart, very educated, very well-traveled, very cultured people. Love them. They're among my favorite clients, probably my all-time favorite. Anyway, someone would raise their hand in the back and will say, listen, Graham, the world around us is built on the non-contradiction principle. The building we're sitting on is built on the non-contradiction principle. If we surrender that principle, where does that leave us? Maybe it's good entertaining the idea as a kind of an Alice in Wonderland digression, but in the engineering world, we cannot afford to take, the non-contradiction principle and just throw it away.
Yeah, look, a lot of this is just not true, Nicola. The world is built on non-contradiction is just the view of, it's just an assertion of the principle of non-contradiction, right? If someone asserts to you contradictions can't possibly be true, you say, what I said to you, why? Now,
the bridge is either going to fall or stand. The building is going to crumble in the first whiff of wind.
That's fine. But no dialetheist says that all contradictions are true. And quoting one example does not prove a universal generalization, right? So that's beside the point. What you need is just not one example of a contradiction that can't be true. You need an argument that no contradiction can possibly be true. And so you need an argument for the principle of non-contradiction. And it's hard enough for a philosopher to give that. You're not going to get it from an engineer.
Yeah, and the engineer would like for a clear-cut formula or something that would give you a criterion.
Can't have what you want. Okay, look, now that's reality. What about our theorization? Well, it's just not true that scientists and engineers do not work with contradictory theories. They do. Okay, let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, one of the most famous physical theories in history was inconsistent. That was Newtonian dynamics, because it was based on the infinitesimal calculus, and the infinitesimal calculus was recognized as inconsistent because infinitesimals had contradictory properties. Everybody knew this. It was, ridiculed by Berkeley. Okay, the theory of infinitesimals disappeared, but that was 200 years later. And for 200 years, Newtonian dynamics was based on the infinitesimal calculus. It was based on an inconsistent theory. All right, one example. Second example, more relevant to engineering. Often our theories of how our observable instruments work is based on a theory which is inconsistent with our theory of what it is we're measuring. So we have theories about how we measure things, which uses instruments, and we have certain theories about how they work. And then we have different theories which explain how the thing itself works. And so often these two theories are inconsistent. This is a standard point that's often made by philosophers of science. The point is you help yourself to whatever theory gives you the right answers. That's what engineers do, right? That's what mostly physicists do, for that matter. Physicists and engineers have no problem about, working with different theories which are inconsistent with each other, as long as when they put the bits together, it gives the right answer.
So could you say then that just like in physics, we have the physics of the very large objects in our cosmos and the physics of the very tiny little things or particles, the tiniest, smallest little things that we're aware of? which we call quantum mechanics. And those two theories are kind of hard to reconcile, if not in contradiction with each other.
This is another very good example. I mean, not just to do with instruments, but to do with some of our most fundamental theories of the cosmos. I mean, if you're a physicist, the two most important theories in modern physics are general theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, okay? And these are well known to not play good together. No, not to put too fine a point on it. They're inconsistent with each other. And I don't think this is my view. This is a standard view that there's a problem in the foundations of physics. Yet, no, physicists will appeal to both when it suits them. It gives the right answer. So, is it recognized a problem? Yeah, probably. People are looking for a way of making them fit together because it's. But anyway, you know, it shows that physicists and the technologists, the engineers who work on them, are quite happy to work with inconsistent theories or theories which are inconsistent with each other just because they give the right answer.
So in a way, dialetheism is to logic what quantum mechanics is to classical physics.
Well, it's what quantum mechanics is to the general theory of relativity.
Okay.
Look, it's
a framework that forces us to rethink our deepest assumptions and kind of end up in a contradiction, really.
Oh, I see. That's what you mean. Yes, in that respect, yes, it's similar. But, well, go on.
Yeah, no. That's kind of my perception. So I wanted to get your take on it because I'm literally struggling. I just like Richard Feynman said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. I don't even think I understand dialetheism. I struggle with the explosion. I struggle with embracing the contradiction, not particularly with the liar's paradox, but because I struggle to figure out which one is true and which one is false.
Yeah, well, welcome to adult life. You know, it's difficult to figure out the truth sometimes. But let me give you an analogy which may or may not help. Look, Einstein came up with the special theory of relativity in 1905. The special theory is very strange to Newtonian sensibilities. You know, time goes at different rates in different frames. Might even go backwards in some frame according to my frame. This is, if you're a Newtonian, this is crazy. And that was the reaction of a lot of scientists at the time. How can this possibly be? Well, they couldn't understand how it could possibly be because they were sort of in a Newtonian mindset and they just couldn't see how this could work. Okay. What happened? Because within the next 5 or 6 years, the special theory was almost universally adopted. So what happened to change it? Well, it's because the scientists got used to working with the new theory. They studied it. They got to understand the mathematics. They looked at the predictions it made. And they got their head around the way this new theoretical perspective on the world worked. So often when we have this kind of gestalt of how could that possibly be, the answer is, well, just study the new theory. And in the case of dialetheism, one of the things you've got to do is come to understand the logical basis of it. If you're sort of taught that truth and falsity are exclusive and exhaustive, end of story, and someone comes along and says, no, they're not, you're going to say, what? That's not what I was taught in Logic 100. So how can that be? Well, how can that be is you learn the new machinery, you learn the new theory, and then slowly you start to come to understand the new theory. You might not agree with it, but at least you get to understand what it means to operate with this new theory.
Well, perhaps now is the time to move a little bit further east. But before that, I just want to grab one last thing that may or may not be helpful in our direction east. Because last time in the beginning of our conversation, you said that there is actually a difference between rationality and logic. Can you unpack that for me? Because I struggle with this.
Yeah. So look, the point is really quite straightforward. There have been times in the history of philosophy where logic is just used as a synonym for rationality. Okay. But remember how I said how modern logicians understand the word logic nowadays. Logic is a study of what follows from what and why. What usually deductive, sometimes non-deductive arguments are valid. And reasoning is certainly involved in rationality. Of course it is. Reasoning, one thing reasoning involves is argumentation, and you would hope that when you argue, you use valid arguments. Okay. But there's lots more to rationality than simply arguing. There's theory formation, there's theory choice. We've just talked about that. So if you have to choose between theories, and I choose the theory which is overall best on these criteria we talked about, and you choose one which is a clunker, that's irrational. Okay? And that's got nothing to do with what follows from what. Simply, that's got to do with the rationality of theory choice. So, I mean, there's a lot more to rationality than simply using valid arguments. I mean, there's a question of where your premises come from as well. So, I mean, that was what I had in mind when I said when I distinguished between logic and rationality. I mean, arguing validly is as a part of rationality, but there's lots more to it than that.
Very well. So let us go east and ask whether at the same time that Aristotle was formulating the principle of the non-excluded middle and non-contradiction and things that influenced Western logic for a couple thousand years, at the same time in the Far East, there was a completely different way of reasoning.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what it consisted of, how it was different, and why does it matter? Why is it important, and has it survived until today? Because as we've seen, Aristotle's principles or logic are not widely accepted as something useful or practical or correct or truthful today. So has Buddhism fared better than Aristotle? I mean, it couldn't be, right?
Okay. Look, for a start, let me remind you that the principle of non-contradiction is a principle of metaphysics, not logic. Okay? Aristotle's logic was syllogistic. Syllogistic was a paraconsistent theory, as I pointed out last time. So it's probably more accurate to remember that we're dealing with metaphysical issues here. Okay, so with that warning aside, Eastern philosophy is not a monolith any more than Western philosophy is. In fact, there's quite a big distinction between Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy. Chinese philosophy has always been much more oriented towards ethics and political philosophy. And Indian philosophy has had those things, of course, but has often been more interested in metaphysics. Although both Indian and Chinese philosophy are interested in questions about how you should live, like ancient Greek philosophy. Okay. Anyway, so because they're not one thing, there's no simple answer to your question.
Let's take the mainstream, if you want to break it down to Buddhism and Hinduism, if you want to make that distinction.
Oh, okay. Well, let's just talk about India for a moment. So there are many different schools of Indian thought. They're all present by about the 5th century BCE, or at least the 4th or 3rd century BCE, although, of course, they develop after that. And there are, Hindu positions, Buddhist positions, Jain positions, and some other positions, and they're different. Now, they don't all have the same attitude towards contradictions as each other, and in fact, their views change from different sort of sub-theories or sub-views. Let's just start with Buddhism. So there is a principle in Buddhist thought called the catastrophic. Actually, it's older than the Buddha. It's in place when the Buddha's teaching in the 5th century BCE. And the principle says that catastrophic means 4 points, 4 corners, 4 things, all right? What it's saying is that if I make some statement to you, it's either true or false or both or neither. Now, of course, we're already out of the Aristotelian bailiwick here because only the first 2 are recognized by Aristotle, but there are 4. And so the Chaturshkoti is in play in the early Buddhist sutras, as it is in Indian thought generally in his time. Now, the Chaturshkoti plays a very significant role in the development of Buddhist thought. So it's integral to the work of the great Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. Okay, so at least until that time, you can well argue that people were quite happy, or Buddhist philosophers are quite happy with the thought that some things could be both true or false or neither true or false. Of course, they didn't formalize these views in the way the modern logician would. Aristotle couldn't have done the same either because he didn't have the techniques of modern mathematics. But clearly, there's a kind of metaphysical picture here which could inform developing a formal logic underlying there's already a metaphysical picture here which could be used to underlie the development of modern formal logic. Okay, now the situation changes around the 5th, 6th century of the Common Era because at this time India is a hotbed of debate. So there are Buddhists, different kinds of Buddhists, in fact. There are Hindus of different schools. There are Jains of at least 2 different schools, and there are other views as well. And they're all arguing against each other, okay? Now, there's one really important school of Hindu thought called Nyaya. They're sometimes these sort of thought of as the logicians or the epistemologists of Hinduism. And they do subscribe to the principle of non-contradiction. Okay, and they argue against Buddhists, and crudely, the Nyaya win. So if you look at the great Buddhist logicians or epistemologists of the middle of the 1st millennium in India, Dignaga and Dharmakirti, they come to defend the law of non-contradiction. So after that, people who follow Dignaga and Dharmakirti will endorse the law. Okay, so that tells you something, a little bit about Buddhism and Hinduism. Jainism is different again, and the Jains are a fascinating people. According to the Buddhists, at least the early Buddhists, there are 4 possibilities. According to the Jains, there are 7. 7? Yes, they have a 7-valued logic. It's called the Saptabhangi. And gosh, look, I'm not going to go into the weeds now, but roughly speaking, they say that what are the 7 possibilities? Well, there are 3 possibilities, true, false, and a 3rd possibility, which is either both or neither. It's not clear. And then there's every non-empty combination of those 3. And that's 7 if you think about it, because it's 2 to the 3 minus 1. Okay. So they have this theory called the Saptabangi, says that if you're considering what the situation is, you've got 7 possibilities, and some of those are contradictory. Might be true and false, or one. It's a fascinating logical system, and as you can imagine, when modern logicians get their hands on this, they have a lot of fun.
Oh. I like the Jains because they're vegan like me. I've been vegan for about 10 years now, so that's one thing we have with them in common, but definitely not 7 possibilities in my mind. Well,
as you can imagine, it's not arbitrary. I mean, it's based on a certain metaphysics, and the physics says that reality is many-faceted. So reality is not a unity. Reality consists of many facets, and one thing can hold in one facet and different in and something contradictory can hold in a different facet. So it has a kind of perspectival metaphysics, which starts to make more sense of this kind of 7 value business.
Does that have to do anything with the multiple world hypothesis in quantum mechanics?
No.
Or could it have anything? I didn't ask the proper question. So no, it doesn't have to do anything because these guys were thousands of years ago. But could it be connected to that view in a logical way where both of those views are consistent with each other?
Not really quantum mechanics, but it does have that kind of connection, which is this. As I just said, modern logicians can have a lot of fun with this view. So there are analyses, in terms of modern logical techniques, constructions, which apply world semantics, or if you like, possible world semantics. So each facet is identified with the possible world. And so there is a connection between theories of worlds and a Jain metaphysics. Yes, that is there.
Fascinating. Okay, so where does the idea of Svabhava come? And what does that idea stand for anyway? How does it reshape our understanding of metaphysics, epistemology, truth, contradiction?
Okay. All right. So it's a Sanskrit word, svabhava, svabhava, which literally translated means something like self. Bhava means being or nature. So it's self-being, self-nature. And as I said, Buddhism develops many different pictures, many different metaphysics after the Buddha for the next 2,000 years. But the earliest metaphysical picture that develops after the Buddha is called Abhidharma Buddhism. Abhidharma means sort of higher teachings. It's not terribly important, the meaning of the word. But what the Abhidharma philosophers thought was this. There's an ultimate reality, a thing that reality is really made of, okay? And then the rest of reality is a kind of can be reduced to that, either by a process of some kind of reduction or conceptual construction. We can talk about the details, but there's this fundamental ultimate reality, and then there's this sort of derivative reality in some sense. Okay. This picture is quite familiar from modern philosophy of science, which tells us that, there's a fundamental reality, a physical reality composed of, and then you take your picks, quarks or whatever. And then the rest of the world is constructed from these kinds of things, maybe mereologically, maybe some other way. But there's an ultimate reality, which is a certain nature, and then there's the stuff that's built on top of that. Now, the Abhidharma philosophers thought that the things which constitute ultimate reality had this property of svabhava. that they had an intrinsic nature. They were the elements of ultimate reality, which they call dharmas, were objects which were what they are independently of anything else. So they had an intrinsic nature, and each dharma had its nature independent of any other. It's like, you take a quark, and it is what it is. It has its properties which are internal to it, and the property of this quark is independent of that quark. Right? So ultimately, reality was composed of these things with svabhava. Now, the things that are constructed out of them don't have this independent nature because they depend, the things in this constructed reality depend on what they are, on the dharmas, okay? So they don't have svabhava, but the ultimate elements of reality do, okay? So that was the view which you still find in only one branch of Buddhism nowadays, which is Theravada, which you tend to find in Southeast Asia. But at the turn of the Common Era, a new form of Buddhism developed, usually called Mahayana, which means greater vehicle for what it's worth. And the most important theorist of Mahayana, at least initially, was this philosophy Nagarjuna in the 1st or 2nd century of India. We don't know a great deal about him, but he attacks this earlier metaphysical view. And he marshals a bank of arguments to the effect that essentially nothing has svabhava. Everything is shunya, meaning empty. And what is it empty of? It's empty as svabhava. So, of course, the Abhidharma philosophers were quite happy with the thought that some things don't have svabhava, or the things we kind of construct conceptually out of the ultimate elements of reality. But Nagarjuna said that there are no ultimate elements of reality in that sense. There is nothing with svabhava. Everything is empty. So that's a denial of svabhava, and that's shunya. Everything is empty. Of course, that has many metaphysical, epistemological, soteriological ramifications. And then, Buddhist philosophers explore those for the next 2,000 years.
I'm trying to remember. It's reminding me of two people, that idea. One was Carl Sagan, who said that if you want to make apple pie, you have to start with the universe. But was it Walt Whitman or Emerson who said that when you pull one thing apart, you find the whole world inside of it?
Right. This is a familiar picture in Buddhism. And there are especially Chinese Buddhist views, which will argue for exactly the same. They have very sophisticated arguments.
Yeah, that's the idea. And even I think Miyamoto Musashi was talking how if you learn one thing, if you understand one thing, really, you have understood everything. And so you can be painting or whatever and still learn about sword fighting and stuff like that. So it's...
Yeah, well, Musashi wasn't a philosopher, of course, but he practiced Zen. And Zen is one of originally it was Chinese, but it goes into Japan. In China, it's called Chan.
Yeah.
Zen is just the Japanese pronunciation of that character. And Zen, or many Zen thinkers also take over the view, this sort of holographic view of reality, such that in any part you find the whole. And of course, in the whole, you find all the parts. So this has been deeply influential on East Asian Buddhism.
So tell me then, has Eastern way of reasoning, whether Buddhism, whether Zen Buddhism, whether Hinduism, whether Jainism, fared better than Aristotle from your point of view as a logician in modern day 21st century human civilization?
Well, that's sort of comparing. Look, Aristotle had a formal logic, and you don't find many formal logics in the West. You don't find any in China. You do find them in Hinduism and Buddhism around the 5th or the 6th century. These guys have a theory of Hetuvada arguments, which is not exactly the same as syllogistic, but it's very similar to syllogistic. That's a rather crass similarity, but it's okay for the moment. It's at that level of sophistication, right? So these guys in Aristotle have roughly the same kind of approach to logic, roughly. But nowadays, there was a revolution in logic at the turn of the 19th century. I think we talked about that last time. And it was based on developments in mathematics in the West. That caused a revolution in logic. And logic will never go back. It gave us a whole bunch of techniques to theorize about many things, including various metaphysical views. And you can apply those techniques just as well to metaphysical theories, whether it's the view of metaphysics of Plato or Kant or Wittgenstein or Nagarjuna or Dogen or so modern mathematical logic has given us a toolkit, a very useful and very powerful toolkit to apply to any philosophical tradition you'll want to think about.
So it would appear then that Buddhism and logic aren't opposites.
No.
Does that mean then that science and religion aren't necessarily opposites either? Because most people would say Buddhism is a religion. I know you're looking at it from a philosophical point of view, so am I. That's why we love it so much. But it's commonly presumed or perceived as a religion. And so the question is the general implication of that kind of peaceful cohabitation, if you will, is science and religion incompatible, or are they compatible?
Yeah. Okay, look, what is a religion? Okay, well, that's a contentious question, but religions have many components. They will have ethics, they will have a priesthood, they will have sacred books, they'll have sacred places, they will have rituals, and they will all have a philosophy, right? You don't have to, you might think the philosophy is okay without worrying about all the rest. Now, that's going to be true of any religion, and it's true just as much of Christianity as it is of Buddhism. So Christianity has great philosophers. Many of the medieval Latin philosophers, of course, Christians. Aquinas, for example, had a very sophisticated metaphysics and ethics based on Aristotle. And you couldn't accept a lot of Aquinas' views without being a Catholic. Okay. So that's the first thing. Many bits of philosophy have been integrally connected with religions. That's true of every religion I know, actually, East or West. But you can be very sympathetic to a lot of the philosophical views without endorsing the religion. And again, that's true of all religions. Okay.
But the key is the logic. Where does logic fit within that relationship? Because, logic is a crucial part of science. And so can we have peaceful cohabitation in the West between...
Well, look, let's come back to Buddhism in a second. Let's talk about Christianity. So notoriously, there was an enormous clash between Christianity and science starting in the late 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th
The
centuries.
Enlightenment, yeah.
Well, after that, after the scientific revolution, because science seemed to deny many of the things that Christians held dear to them. Okay, Galileo had his thumbscrews, and Copernicus wasn't cared for because he literally moved people from the center of the cosmos. Darwin was ridiculed for his views on evolution because they contradicted creationism. Now, so there is a history of tension between science and Christianity. You cannot deny
Tension is a mild word, I would say.
Whatever. Now, what has happened? Well, because of the power of science, most Christians have come to concede that when the science is right about the cosmos and evolution and so on. So most Christians, let me come back to the exceptions in a moment, most Christians have come to accept that you've got to accept a scientific view of the nature of the cosmos, humanity, and so on. And you therefore have to interpret parts of the Bible metaphorically or poetically or figuratively or something. And this is standard in most Christian traditions I know. Okay? The Bible is not always literally true. Now, the exception is Christian fundamentalists who seem to be particularly active in the United States, who insist on teaching creationism on a par with evolutionary theory in schools. Okay, so between modern science and fundamentalists, there's still this tension.
There is an ongoing backlash at every level of education, particularly in the United States now, from primary education to high school and even to university, between the teachings of the dominant religion and science of all kinds of shapes and fields and examples.
Yep. So, I mean, between that kind of Christian and science, there still is this clash, right? Now, let's come back to Buddhism. Buddhism, in many ways, has been, at least officially, less dogmatic and doctrinaire because Buddhism has had a sort of analysis or proto-analysis of the human mind and the way it works, the nature of reality and its interconnectedness. It's always emphasized the importance of causation in understanding how things happen and so on. So it has sort of certain sort of things which you may call proto-scientific in them, as does Christianity to the extent that it takes over Aristotle. But two things. First of all, oddly enough, a number of the sort of traditional views of human cognition and so on have actually are very closely related to what's been discovered in cognitive psychology and neuropsychology. Of course, it's much more sophisticated. But views about how cognition works and the fact that we have sort of that people's minds are not unitary, they're fragmented, they have bits which interact, even though we have this illusion that a person has a unitary self, as it were. Buddhism has always been against that. And that's pretty much what modern cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroanatomy is telling us. But anyway, that's sort of by the by, because Buddhism has always had the view that in the end, you can accept something only if it makes sense. So one of the famous sutras, the Kalama Sutra, says, do not believe something just because you find it in the book, just because some smart bastard tells you it, just because, there's a sociological reason to believe it. Believe something if it works. So, how do you know if things work? Well, how do you know how to play chess? Well, you look at what the experts do. How do you know how the world works? Well, you look at what the experts say. Who are the experts? They're scientists. Okay? So if you want to know how the world works, you look at what science tells you. And the Dalai Lama, who is obviously a religious personality, as well as a very good philosopher, as that matter, is on record as saying, look, if there are things in Buddhism which contradict modern science, then it's the Buddhist views that have to go. So
that's a pretty courageous point of view and way to live. And I'm afraid many of us in the West are way behind it institutionally.
Well, look, he's a very smart bastard, no doubt about that. If you pardon the pun, he's somewhat enlightened. So, I mean, of course, there have been sort of dogmatists in Buddhism, as there have been dogmatists in any religion.
Sure.
But generally speaking, as a sort of sweeping generalization, Buddhism has been more prepared to accept and accommodate developments in modern science than Christianity has, which has always kicked against the traces.
Yeah, I have had several Buddhists on my podcast before. One was a Zen priest from a Buddhist temple in Japan, and they have recently recognized an AI in his temple as a member. And that leads me to our next question here. Let's kind of twist the conversation or turn the conversation to face a little bit more contemporary issues which are big in popular culture, and maybe even look into the future if we can, the future of thinking, the future of thought, the future of logic. So it would appear to me that logic underpins computers and AI today. Would you agree with that?
No.
Interesting.
Look, the origins of computational science are heavily connected with logic. So in the 1930s was developed...
Isn't Boolean logic like fundamental to modern computing today?
Computation theory is. Okay, so the theory of computation was developed in the 1930s, before there were computers, and that heavily influenced the development of modern computers. So that connection is certainly there. But that's what happens at the hardware level, not what happens at the software level. And the thing about computers is that they can run any algorithm, and most logics can be set up algorithmically. That's a very crude way of putting it, but it will do for the moment. So you can run any logic on any computational device. That's called the Church-Turing thesis. That connection is there, but it has nothing to do specifically with formal logic. What logic you imply when you reason is not connected with computation theory, because computers can run any kind of logic.
So, but what kind of logic do they run? Because I don't think they
can run any kind of logic.
They can run any kind of logic in theory, but in practice, I don't think they run Dialetheist or, any kind of non-classical logic, do they?
Look, a logic hardware is just a series of currents which are on or off, connected in certain ways. That's not logic, that's physics.
So my whole perception then was completely wrong, that logic underpins computers and AI, and if that's not even acceptable to you, then definitely you wouldn't accept the idea that classical logic is dominant there.
Right. Now, look, modern computational, traditional computational hardware is based on something called logic gates. Okay? Logic gates, I mean, it's just currents which are on or off combined in certain ways.
Yeah.
And the ways they can be connected are called logic gates. And the simplifying assumption is the current is either running or it isn't. And you figure out what the logic gate does by certain processes, which are called AND gates or NAND gates or NOT gates. And those gates work in the same way as the connectives in classical propositional logic. Okay? So you can apply classical proposition logic to do some engineering to find the simplest connection of gates, which will do what you want. Okay? So sometimes that's called Boolean logic. So you can say Boolean logic underlies how logic gates work in a computer and how propositional calculus works. But I mean, Boolean logic is an algebraic structure, and algebraic structures can have many applications. So simplifying, electronic circuits and reasoning are not the same thing. And as I said, any logic which can be formalized as a series of rules can be run on a modern computer.
Yeah, your understanding is much more granular and deeper than the idea that the level I was trying to place that statement on. Okay, so let's see where we go from here then. So if humans routinely tolerate ambiguity and contradiction, as it seems that we do, does AI eventually need non-classical logics of some kind or another?
Yeah. Okay, this brings me to the next point. Never mind what goes on at the hardware level. When AI was traditionally developed, so now we're talking about earliest 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, really till the year 2000. What people did was produce systems of rules which could be run on the hardware. They wrote a program. And these system of rules usually worked using classical logic.
That was my previous point, I thought, but you kind of refused to accept it, I think.
No. The programs that were written used classical logic. That does not mean that the hardware used classical logic. Hardware is just a piece of causal mechanism, not a logical anything, right? But the AI systems that were written between the 60s and the 2000s were rule systems that used, well, usually restricted versions of classical logic, because you can't do all of classical logic, because once it gets sufficiently complicated, it's not algorithmic in the required sense. It's not decidable. It's recursively enumerable. But they typically, the rule systems were implemented with classical logic, or at least cut down systems thereof, for practical reasons. Okay, now modern AI works nothing like that. New technology, you probably understand it much better than I do, does not operate that way. It uses neural networks. Neural networks are essentially pattern recognition mechanisms which get trained up on enormous amounts of data. And no one really understands what's going on internally in a sophisticated neural net system, because you just train them up, and by a process of training, which we can go into if you like, they just give the right answers. But they're working on some kind of statistical algorithm, some kind of probabilistic or statistical algorithm. And what's actually going on is very hard to determine. We don't need to know, because we just train them up to give the right answers. Okay. So that's the way a neural network works. And then you get this amazing development in the last 15 years or so with large language models, which allows us to train up these networks to do quite mind-blowing things. Exactly what limits there are to their ability, we don't know yet.
Well,
But
let me see if I can push the question in a different way to see if it makes more sense. So we have accomplished incredible degree of advance and progress within the realm of artificial intelligence. But many people believe, and I'm one of them, that we need many more things to get to true, proper artificial general intelligence. And so perhaps I was wondering if one crucial element might be migrating from classical logic to non-classical logics, to embracing, dialetheism, embracing, intuitionist logic, embracing, paraconsistent logics of any kind that could potentially lead to the next level of breakthrough of intelligence. Because perhaps, yes, scaling laws still work, but they provide breakthroughs of a kind and within the certain realm. And if we are to break through, and many people argue that scaling is all we need to get to true artificial general intelligence. I don't think that's the case. I may be wrong, but I think we need a number of other ingredients to get there. And I am wondering, I don't know if that's the case, but I'm wondering if you think that moving beyond classical logic within as a predominant way of organizing the software of AI would potentially hold that promise to get the next level of intelligence. Because it would appear human intelligence exhibits more than one logic if any of our conversation makes any sense so far to me, it would appear we as humans have come up with many different ideas, many different logics throughout the last 2,000-3,000 years at least.
yeah, look, the quick answer is no, I don't think so. Just because modern AI and large language models in particular don't use logic. They don't use rule systems. What they use is pattern recognition based on neural networks. So you just have this connection of computational units connected by various weights, and you train them up on certain data so they give you the right answer, or at least the answer you hope is right. That doesn't apply logic at all. Now, modern AI is somewhat more complex than that because often large language models outsource computations to other units. And those units may work on rather different principles. Very simple example. I mean, if you want to know the time of a train, you don't search the web to do that. You access the software put out by the people who run the trains. Okay. So large language models do have an ability to outsource certain things to other units. So another perhaps more relevant thing is computation. If you want to know what a computation gives you, you don't sort of search the web for an answer. You hand that problem over to something which does computations. Okay. Now, some of those oracles to which you outsource problems could work on any kind of rule system. Could it be advantageous sometimes to use rule systems based on non-classical logic? Well, maybe. I don't know. I just don't know enough about how these things work.
Well, that's my reasoning, Graham, is like if presumably, so here's what I'm learning from you, and you tell me if I'm totally wrong. There is benefit to using a variety of logics. They enrich our lives, they enrich our perspective, they show us things that we would not consider as possibilities or options otherwise, and they may even get us to embrace or even possibly get out of a tough situation, of a contradictory situation that we cannot resolve in the usual ways. So if there is any such claimed benefit for us, I would presume there would be equal benefit to artificial intelligence. And if we don't want to be limited and we enrich ourselves by doing that step from classical to non-classical logic, I would presume the same should be true to them if we were to hope to improve their ways of reasoning. Because if logic is like what follows from what, AI also could benefit from learning what follows from lot and reasoning better. And it would enrich our life again, too.
Maybe. Look, I think this is a stage of IA we haven't reached yet. AI is very good, essentially, at reproducing what's there, finding out what's there. So I reckon that most undergraduate courses at a university now could be taught by chatbots because undergraduate courses do not aim at producing novelty. Okay. Can they do research? Well, if the research is not simply finding things out, which is well known, but coming up with new ideas, my understanding is that chatbots can't do that yet. I mean, chatbots cannot invent concepts.
That's debatable. There is a very famous moment in the game of Go against Lee Sedol when AlphaGo played, I don't remember if it's move 37.
Yeah, no, I know what you're talking
and
about.
It blew the mind of all the experts.
Yeah, no, that's true. But essentially, that was algorithmic because it could explore positions much well. It used pattern recognition, but it also used search. But it did not come up with a new concept. Okay, so I don't think that if you fed the state of physics into a large language model in 1900, it could have come up with the special theory of relativity. Because large language models, as I understand it, have no mechanism for developing new concepts, which development of new concepts is absolutely crucial to any development in science or sophisticated theorization.
Well, so in a way, you're kind of coming up with the Penrose-Hameroff, in a way, attack against or critique of the mechanistic views of the mind. And on the other hand, I know you're not a supporter of that point of view. So I'm kind of confused because, like, yeah, let's talk about that for a second, and we should start bringing our conversation towards the end here. But Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff famously came with their orchestrated OR theory of consciousness and the idea that it has quantum effects that cannot be duplicated by the current, at least, models of sort of simulating the brain in any way, shape, or form. And if Roger Penrose is correct, we cannot simulate it ever. Where do you stand on that? And how is that connected with your field? Because I mean, it's kind of more of a mathematical, or is it logic too?
The view that the mind is a Turing computer is, I think that's barely credible.
So you agree with them?
Maybe, but not necessarily for their reasons. And I mean, they argued on the basis of things like Gödel's theorems.
Yes.
I just think those arguments are completely fallacious. Rather, I mean, the brain is essentially analog. It's not digital, because okay, there are neurons which fire, but they don't fire all at the same time, so it's not synchronized, and the firing is affected by the chemical baths that these neurons are in. There's no analog. There's nothing similar to that in a hardware computer. So I think whatever's going on in the brain is going to be more complicated than a Turing machine.
Yeah, and that's basically their view. Hameroff said on my podcast that calling a neuron a processor is a great insult to what a neuron does, and the fact that it doesn't have just 0 and 1 state. And there have been some research in the last few years about some, quantum effects within the neurons, perhaps. So there may have been some signs that there may be some new support in terms of scientific support for their theory.
Yeah. So I mean, look, I'm very skeptical that the brain is a Turing machine. I don't think that's very plausible at all. That doesn't mean that certain cognitive processes can't work with algorithms, which could be run on a Turing machine. That's a different matter. And one thing we've discovered is that whatever algorithms run, assuming that the brain does do some things algorithmically, you can do things algorithmically which we just would not have believed. So I've been an academic now for a long time. When I started, there were no computers. We wrote our papers longhand. The departmental secretary, who was always a woman, typed them up. I remember the first time I saw a computer, a laptop computer, a desktop computer on someone's desk. I was gobsmacked. Computation has completely changed academia and everything else for that matter. But I've seen this cycle so many times. Someone says computers will never do X, and within 10 years they're refuted. And I've seen this being claimed for various reasons several times over the last 50 or 60 decades. So I'm very skeptical when someone says computers will never do X, that they're right. Maybe, they will be able to do everything we do eventually and things better than we do. We just have no idea what the new hardware and the new software will be able to achieve.
But in a way, you said that you agree with them that we would not be able to simulate the human brain on a machine.
Well, I said I don't think the human brain is a Turing machine. That doesn't mean that it can't. Well, it doesn't mean that computational devices can't do what humans do, can't do everything that humans do, because we just don't know what the technology is capable of. I mean, I'm not a futurologist. What I know is that predictions that computers will never do X have always turned out to be wrong in the past.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's one of Arthur C. Clarke's laws, three laws. If a respectable aging scientist says that something is impossible, he's probably wrong. And if he says that something is possible, he's probably right.
So when I said that I don't think that current AI systems can come up with conceptual innovations, that was a comment about current systems.
Yeah.
I wasn't suggesting it's an in-principle limitation on every kind of computational technology.
Right. And my question was whether moving from classical to non-classical logics could help us get to that next level. That's what I was wondering about.
Yeah, look, I don't know. These things are inherently unpredictable. But let me just say something. What's at the basis of all technology in the end is mathematics, right? And physicists and engineers apply mathematics in order to do things, get their machines to do things, or get systems to do things. Now, most of the mathematics that's currently used is based on classical logic, or can be. I think that's probably true. But we are now seeing mathematics based on non-classical logics. So mathematics based on intuitionist logic is very old. It's been around for 100 years. Mathematics based on para-consistent logic is a much newer invention, but we now know what para-consistent or inconsistent logics of set theory, topology, linear algebra, geometry are like. I suspect that what I know is that if these inconsistent systems of mathematics could be used to good purpose, they will be. Can they be? I've no idea. Because so often in the history of science, mathematics has been developed which had no application. And then someone's come along and said, oh, yeah, I can apply this. Complex numbers, group theory. So could inconsistent mathematics be deployed in technology and physics 100 years hence? I don't know. It's not impossible, but I have no idea whether it will happen. If it does, then non-classical logic will be involved in these developments simply because we're using non-classical mathematics. I mean, inconsistent mathematics or whatever.
Graham Priest, where can people find more about you and your work?
I suppose the obvious answer is that I have a website which is called grahampriest.net, and on that they will find all my papers and books. But that's all they'll find there, papers and books. If they want something to get a sense of perspective on this, I don't know where they'd go. They may ask a chatbot.
Or they can watch this and other such interviews and lectures of yours that you have done throughout the years.
They can do that. I mean, the chatbots are actually quite good at providing factual information. Even they're quite good at abstracting from complex data a sort of general synopsis. That's one thing they're very good at. So I guess you can always try asking a chatbot, but always you treat these things with care because they hallucinate.
Yeah, when they're wrong and you're non-expert, you don't know it, so you don't have a correcting mechanism, and you embrace what they tell you for truth while it may not be.
Correct.
Graham, so between this conversation and the previous one we've had, we might end up with a 3-hour recording. So, and we've covered so much. It was mostly kind of introductory to non-classical logic material, which is perhaps very low level for you. But what's the best way to wrap up our conversation in your view? How do you want to send us away? What's the message that you want to send us away with?
If there is one, it's got to be something like, keep an open mind. Don't suppose that everything that's worth knowing is known now, because you'll be proved wrong. Human knowledge in every sphere we have has been developing for a long time, and it's going to continue developing for the foreseeable future, probably forever. And if you close your mind to possible developments, then you're going to be caught out. So keep an open mind on everything, and don't keep it so open that you accept any old garbage. Treat views on the evidence there is for them.
Yeah, speaking of keeping an open mind, I have to thank Tim Beeler, who cracked my mind open with the concept that, there is more than one kind of logic. And you have generously shared your time with us today and our previous conversation to widen our perception of all the many possibilities and kinds of logics that we can consider while confronting anything we may confront, any kind of situation, and use the best theory, as you say, to move forward.
Well, thank you for having me on your program.